Today we're going to talk about using gesture drawing as a way of building a still life, from general to specific. So starting off looking for very loose ideas of size, shape, and placement, and at the same time considering grouping. Number 3, looking for positive and negative space. Also looking for use of perceptual grid to double check work. And then finally proportion and unit measuring as another way of double checking that same work. The last two I would like to mention are much more analytical in their approach, where the first three are more organic or intuitive or otherwise emotional based. Early on in the drawing, I'm looking for size, shape, and placement. But I'm not drawing exact boxes, I'm not drawing exact spheres or cylinders. It's more about thinking of these as placeholders and how much space they occupy on the page. I'm also thinking a lot about layout and where will they fall in relation to each other. So you might consider these to be lassos or air bubbles or containers that are holding the idea of the object, but you don't want to draw the exact thing because that will slow you down. You want to put down the idea very quickly. While the last slide was a very cleaned up version, this is in reality how gesture drawing might look. It is the pathway of the eyes. So if you imagine anywhere where your eye can move, your pencil can follow. So in that way, it will look like a controlled scribbling or a ball of yarn, but it simply doesn't stop because an object stops. This drawing, while it looks very messy, your drawing doesn't have to, because the early gesture drawing will be so light, the way you're handling the pencil, that it's going to be very hard to see this type of line in your final piece. Next up, we're going to talk about grouping, or using drawing as a way to identify two major groups or three major groups instead of a number of objects. With my drawing, you can see how there is 6 objects, but by breaking that up into 2 groups, I'm able to take that big problem and work on the left side and the right side independently. Another way that we can think about grouping is the entirety of all the objects. So again, instead of thinking of these as being 6 individuals, we have one large group. This one large group is sometimes referred to as an envelope or notional space. This notional space or envelope just happens to be an elongated oval shape. But others, if you start to look at the entirety of those objects, might fit into a large triangle or tall rectangle or other shape. Moving past grouping, let's talk about positive and negative space. Oftentimes when we sit down and look at a setup, we want to draw the objects. We want to identify with the things that we can name or touch. But it's also really helpful to look at the air between. In this drawing, you can see that there's some air bubbles or lassos of blue line to identify the spaces that happen between the objects. And this reverse thinking, or changing to look into the negative space instead of the positive, can be a helpful way to look at the spaces that happen between and the layout of the overall piece. Again, in your drawing, these lines would be so light that they're not going to appear as they do in this slide. They're going to be very light, they're going to be very loose, and they're not going to be a distraction. So as I mentioned, the first 3 were more intuitive or emotional based. The remaining 2 are more logic, reason, and math based. The use of the perceptual grid is a way of associating one object and finding out how it aligns with others across the page. And the way that the perceptual grid is discovered is by taking the dowel rod and looking at your still life through it. By moving it up and down and scanning it like a copy machine or scanner, you're able to see that parts of the still life will align with each other. The left, there may be some areas that line up with the right. The top and the bottom might line up as well. But we only know that by holding it up and moving it slowly and looking at it analytically. What I like about this process is that we're able to find something new by using the perceptual grid or these verticals and horizontals. And as we're starting to draw, we start to combine gesture or that earlier drawing and basically edit this. So we're using the grid lines as a way of telling us if it's correct or if it's not. And if it's correct, we can start to draw a little bit darker, but if not, it's not a big deal because it's going to be so light and loose that we can move things around and get them to align in the proper way. And while this illustration has the line starting from the sphere in the middle, you can start to see that other areas can benefit from those grid lines all the same. Again, what this requires is that some areas need to be correct, and as we discover those areas that are correct, other areas of the drawing will catch up to it. But we do have anchor points that can be areas where the grid lines begin, would be the tops, the bottoms, the sides, corners, but also middles of objects. So imagine a process of drawing where you find something and you feel like it's correct, but you want to double check it within the entirety of the piece. And this is where you might pull a vertical or horizontal from any of those anchor points, being the tops, bottoms, sides, corners, or middles. And once you look at that in real life and compare it to your drawing, you'll find that it will either be correct or it won't. And this process will happen again and again where you gesture and then double check it with a vertical or horizontal. So while perceptual grid is the use of the dowel rod to scan up and down and side to side to find those associations, we also have proportion and unit measuring, which is using the dowel rod in a slightly different way. In this way, we're going to look at the size of one object and compare it to another object or another area of the drawing. As we talked about grouping, we mentioned how we can look at the entire setup versus the multitude of objects that inhabit that space. And we can use proportion or measuring as a way of gauging the ratio of that entire setup. With these blue lines, you can see that this is clearly a wider still life than it is tall. But how wide is it? We can use unit measuring to check that. If we consider the height 1 unit, then we can turn that measurement on its side and discover that when held horizontally and counting over, it's almost 2. This again is called the envelope or the notional space, which is a ratio that holds the entire setup. We can consider this 1 unit compared to how many units wide. Or if you find it easier to find the width first, you can use a smaller number for the height in this case. So in this image, I'm going to use unit measuring to determine how large is the sphere compared to other objects around it. The process for this is to first hold the dowel rod out and measure the height or the width of the sphere, and then count up or to the side or down. And by doing so, you're able to find out how many of that object you're able to fill until reaching other objects or the end of the page. Just a quick reminder about unit measuring. It's only helpful if that object that you're measuring is correct. So it's a very good idea to lay down a gesture, draw on top of that, refine it, edit that. And once you feel pretty good that that object's in the right spot and the right size, then you're able to use it to compare to other objects around it. And the last thing I want to mention before I go to the video demo is that all of these techniques are useful because they allow you to go back and look at something new. And by looking at something in a new way, you're able to refine and edit your drawing so that you're not simply drawing something once and leaving it to be. The act of drawing can be somewhat intimidating, so I think as good practice, it's nice to be able to simply look at something and ask yourself, where do your eyes freely move? And if you were to do a gesture, can you follow your eyes with your hand? Also, if you start to look at this analytically, where does the perceptual grid happen? So looking at the very tops and bottoms, sides, middles, and corners in which the perceptual grid would touch. And that way you can find associations between one object and another through those straight line approaches. For the sake of the demo, I'm going to play this a little bit accelerated at times, but the full drawing took about an hour, maybe an hour and a half. As I'm drawing, you're going to see keywords pop up on the screen, but this is not one where I'm simply going step 1, step 2, step 3. I'm actually going back and inviting back into the drawing some of those earlier steps, because at times I might want to take a more gestural approach to double check the work, and then other times I might want to take a more analytical straight line approach. A few things I might want to point out while the video is playing is how I'm holding the pencil. I'm holding it from the back, I'm using my entire arm, and I'm making sure that most of the weight of my arm is below my hand. So the best way that I can describe this is I want to touch this as light as possible. The same way that if you're wanting to run a bath, you might skim your hand over the bath, but you're not pushing your arm into the water. That sensitivity is really important at this stage of the drawing so that you're not drawing too dark, and therefore it's difficult to move something around. As the video winds down, I just wanted to recap a couple things. There's many ways to draw, and I think it's great to take on different techniques. And some of this might be new, but by combining different techniques, some that you might know already and some that are going to be new this semester, you're going to see that there's new habits that will start to form. And you'll be able to double check what you're doing naturally with some of these other techniques that are going to support that. So again, it's tapping into that analytical and intuitive mind, allowing them to talk to each other. And I think it's also great how this can extend into other art forms, not just 2D art, but 3D sculpture or metals or ceramics. But whatever the case, it's all about repetition and trying something and then trying something again on top of it, and really not stopping or giving up. So if you see that there's a problem, remember that mistakes are good. Mistakes will tell you where not to draw. They'll help guide you. They'll tell you the correct spot because they are not it. So keep drawing, and feel free to chat if you have any questions.